Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 390. And this time I'm going to talk about this record which came out in 1960 on Pacific Jazz, Good Friday Blues by the Modest Jazz Trio. This is the only record released by this particular group. It's a one-off, and it features a trio of jazz musicians who were all in one way or another stalwarts of West Coast jazz. The multi-instrumentalist Red Mitchell, the bassist Red Kelly, and the guitarist Jim Hall. This is an original 1960 mono copy. When I sat down to do this review, I had it in the back of my mind that there had not been an American reissue since the original pressing. I went back to check and hey presto, actually there's been a Tone Poet release of this, I think in September. And that's a good thing because the original pressings are pretty pricey. This is a piano trio record with a couple of quirks. First of all, it's drumless, so the lineup is piano, bass, and guitar. And secondly, Red Mitchell, very well known, perhaps the better known of the two bassists on here, is actually not on bass, he's on piano. That's pretty unusual for him. In the first 30 years of his career, I think he had something like 3 piano credits, but he acquits himself very well. I previously discussed Red Mitchell's career at various points, certainly in my review of his debut for Contemporary Records presenting Red Mitchell, but also in some other reviews as well. And I've touched here and there on Jim Hall, not quite as much. But in this review, I'd like to spend a bit more time on Red Kelly, the bass player. A consummate sideman and somebody who is valued, highly valued by band leaders for many decades. Red Kelly was from a town called Shelby, Montana, which prior to his birth was best known, and may still be best known, for hosting a world championship fight in 1923 which completely bankrupted the town. With a lot of help from local banks, the promoters guaranteed Jack Dempsey, the champ, and his challenger a huge purse and huge appearance money to come all the way out to Montana to participate in this fight. They built a purpose-built stadium out of wood, but unfortunately, when they built the stadium, they neglected to make sure that you couldn't actually see the ring from outside the stadium, which of course you could. They took very little in terms of gate money. The banks were bankrupted, the town was bankrupted, and into this fiasco, into this hangover of broken dreams, Red Kelly was born in August 1927. His family was very poor, there's not much known about them, and he was abandoned at an orphanage around age 2, and he lived at orphanages, one or another, until he was age 16. He himself described his own childhood as Dickensian. He contracted polio when he was just a little kid. The disease left him unable to pursue his original musical ambition, which was as a drummer because his left foot couldn't work the hi-hat. In 1943, at age 16, he moves to Seattle, maybe on his own, maybe with his birth family, no one's really quite clear. He ends up at Seattle Prep High School, which is where he first encounters the double bass. Falls in love with the instrument, he has a lot of natural ability, and he ends up being mentored by a local piano player and band leader, a guy called Johnny Whitwer, who ran the band at a local Chinese restaurant/nightclub in Tacoma called the China Pheasant. He develops rapidly, and in a year or so, he's scooped up by a touring band leader, a guy called Tiny Hill, ironically named Tiny, who billed himself also as America's biggest band leader, which is something akin to England's loudest band, I guess. Anyway, Kelly ends up joining Tiny Hill, and they tour all over the place with his orchestra. And maybe because of Kelly's unhappy and uncertain upbringing, who knows, but Kelly found himself really at home on the road, and it's on the road that he spends pretty much the next 30 years, never really putting down roots anywhere. Over the years, he plays with all kinds of bands. He plays with Charlie Barnett, plays with Stan Kenton, plays with Les Brown, plays with Woody Herman. It's with Woody Herman, actually, he spends most of his time. But his next stop after Tiny Hill was with a different band, a band run by a guy called Chubby Jackson, who was of similar stature as Tiny Hill. Jackson's band was a step up in profile, and it was kind of a strange band in that it featured at least 2 bass players and often 3. When Kelly joined, he was one of the bass players. Jackson, the band leader, was a second, and the third was Curly Russell, who was a well-known bebop player who'd already been on all kinds of bebop sides in New York on Savoy and other labels. In 1948, Chubby's band goes to New York, and they play for a certain amount of time at the Royal Roost, which along with Minton's was basically bebop central at that point in New York. And it's there that Kelly begins to mix with a different class of musician entirely. We're talking about people like Dizzy, Bird, Miles, the whole corpus of modern experimental jazz at the time. This is also when Kelly meets his fellow bass player and future collaborator, Red Mitchell. He began rooming with Mitchell, which leads to a fairly famous case of mistaken identity in jazz history, which I guess we could call Too Many Reds. A third Red, Red Norvo, the Vibes player, in 1949 was looking to move out to LA to settle down there and establish a band, a trio. He He already had Tal Farlow, the guitarist, in tow, and he was looking for a bass player. He phones up their apartment looking for Red Mitchell, ends up getting Red Kelly on the phone, and it's Kelly who ends up getting into the car with Norvo with his bass as they set off for LA. Now, it's not exactly clear at what point Norvo figures out that he's got Kelly instead of Mitchell, but in any event, it's indisputable that the first bass player in Norvo's West Coast trio was Red Kelly. The trio played initially at that famous spawning ground for West Coast jazz, The Hague, inadvertently playing a role in the emergence of Gerry Mulligan's pianoless quartet because the small stage couldn't accommodate vibes and piano, so piano went and Mulligan had to make do. But Red Kelly didn't stay long with Red Norvo. At that point, around 1950, he left to join Woody Herman's band. His replacement, incidentally, in the Norvo trio was a young Charles Mingus. Kelly spends the 1950s with Woody Herman's band and other bands like those led by Stan Kenton and Maynard Ferguson. And while he'd almost certainly been heard on record in an uncredited way before this point, his first recording credit occurs with Woody Herman in 1954. During the 1950s, during his time in these big bands, he became more and more interested in small group sounds, and in particular in the cool sounds associated with the West Coast. In 1959, he teams up again with Red Mitchell, this time in nightclubs in Hollywood, and when they played together, what would happen is Mitchell would move to piano and Kelly would play bass. Jim Hall, who was a guitarist whom Mitchell had met in the mid-1950s in LA, comes in later in 1959, starts gigging with them. When this trio forms, it was in the aftermath of the breakup of Red Mitchell's previous quartet, which had featured the wonderful Lorraine Geller on piano, who had very tragically died in 1958. It may well be that Mitchell wanted to continue this trio as a lasting enterprise. That was probably never likely, given Red Kelly's predilection for moving around. And certainly Jim Hall was in high demand elsewhere as well. But they did enter the studio on Easter weekend 1960 at the invitation of Pacific's Dick Bach to make this record. This record was made in one 6-hour session from 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. on Saturday, the 1st of April in 1960. There's not a lot of information about which studio was used. Chances are it was Pacific Jazz's own in-house studio, but Pacific was also recording all over Hollywood at this point, and there's really nothing definitive about that. Dick Bach is the engineer and the producer, which maybe suggests it was Pacific's own studio. Red Mitchell's on piano, Red Kelly's on bass, and Jim Hall's on guitar. There are 6 tracks on here. 2 of them are original, and both of those are by Red Mitchell. The rest of them are standards, including Bill Not Phil, which was the signature tune of the Bill Harris Orchestra, which Red Kelly had almost certainly learned from Chubby Jackson, who had played on the original record. And one more thing to note about the production of the record is that the wonderful cover art is by Charles W. White, who very likely was the same Charles W. White, the well-known visual artist who had relocated out to LA in 1956. Side 1 starts with Good Friday Blues, and if you're a West Coast jazz fan like me, the first thing that will strike you is how lovely Red Mitchell's piano playing is. His crisp chords, Hall's comping will make you forget all about the fact there's no drum kit here. That's followed by Willow Weep for Me, that well-known standard made so famous by Billie Holiday. This is a feature for Jim Hall, who had kind of taken a back seat in the first track. His phrasing is always excellent, and it's rarely better than on this track. The last track on side 1 is I'll Remember You, which is a Johnny Mercer composition. Red Kelly's bass, which is kind of murkily recorded, I find, on this record, is a lot clearer here, mainly because he's playing a much more assertive walking bass line. Side 2 begins with Bill Not Phil. This is a swinging treatment of what I guess you'd call a minor standard. The second track on side 2 is When I Have You, which is the second of the 2 originals by Red Mitchell. For me, the highlight here is Hall's solo, probably his best on the record, and Kelly's solo, again, is a little bit lost in the mud. The closer is I Was Doing All Right, and it's another upbeat vehicle for Hall's excellent playing. This, I can say on a rainy Saturday, is very much a rainy day record, yet the playing is as technically excellent as it is understated. My only real beef with this record is that Bach's engineering does a bit of a disservice to Kelly's bass. I'd love to hear if the Tone Poet reissue has addressed this somehow, but in any event, that is not enough to really harm my enjoyment of the record overall. It's very much a mood record, I would say. There may be times when it doesn't have quite enough adrenaline for some people's taste, but if you're interested in the talents of these performers, and in particular the guitar of Jim Hall, this is a very enjoyable listen. And for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.